Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final lecture in Chapter 3. I think this lecture of any of the lectures that we do all year, I think it's the funnest one. If you take the time to watch the videos, if you're online or looking for other examples that may not be included, you can get a lot of fun out of it, a lot of good examples. But also of any of the lectures we cover, this one I don't really need to give to you in terms of the content. If you wanted to just go look at the amendments themselves and read them, that's all we're doing. So in this lecture, we're going to go through, and we're gonna go through all 27 of the amendments. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about the First Amendment, but outside of that, we're just going to go through and kind of talk about what each of the amendments means and what they do. So let's get started. All right, so the First Amendment is perhaps the greatest amendment we have. It's what everybody links to in a lot of things. And it provides you with these 6 protections: freedom of religion, separation of church and state, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to peacefully assemble, and the right to petition the government. And the question there is, what does this allow us to do, is a really key thing, because one of the things that a lot of people don't necessarily understand is that just because you have freedom of speech doesn't mean that you can say everything that you want, or freedom of religion doesn't mean that you can do everything that you choose to do. And there are limitations. And this is something that we're seeing specifically now going on in this coronavirus pandemic. We've had many people protest, whether it's at the Capitol in Lansing, in this state or in other states, where really they're actually violating First Amendment rights by claiming uses of other amendments, such as their right to bear arms. People going in and carrying weapons, whether or not they actually had the right licenses, like a permit to carry and so forth, taking a weapon into a protest, even if they're not using it, is, and I'm going to use my words carefully here, pay attention to this word, technically a violation of this right here under the First Amendment, even though they're technically not doing anything wrong within the law, going along with the Second Amendment and local laws. So that's where it can kind of get convoluted, and people not necessarily understanding rights and what they can do and the limitations and really what can be enforced at times can cause some issues. Just to kind of get into that. And I don't want to get into any real big specifics after that, because that's a whole other can of worms, and that's not what this is for. But anyways, those are the 6 things that you have under the First Amendment, what you're supposed to be protected by. Also, our press is not subject to what is known as prior restraint. And I want you to look at this picture here. It says internet censorship. Sorry, a First Amendment error has occurred. Well, what prior restraint is our press, unless it's for national security reasons, is not subject to being restrained from the government, or isn't supposed to be. So if, let's say you're a news source and you're trying to put out a news story about, just say, an event that happened, like a hurricane, saying, clean up after a hurricane, saying the government isn't necessarily doing a great job. Our government can't come in say, no, you can't publish that and change the story. They're not supposed to be able to, because that would be that would be prior restraint. We see this in places like China, where you don't have access to the internet, or it's limited in terms of like what you can actually visit. That's prior restraint. So this is kind of what I was trying to tell you guys, talk about in the previous slide with that question of what does this allow us to do, is we have freedoms within our limits. And we've kind of talked about this earlier too, with the idea of the social contract, is just because it's stated that you have it in a basic term, there's interpretations that actually can mean, and they can change. So your First Amendment rights, as well as all your other rights, aren't unlimited. You can't do certain things, and that may change according to the situation, such as, for example, where being ordered to wear a mask in this pandemic is actually not a direct violation of any of your rights, because there's changes within the contract and changes with what's going on at that time. Okay, and now I'm not getting there's specifics and stuff that we can talk about later, but I'm talking about just in general terms. But to back to what we're talking about here is, like, for example, with your free speech, you can't just say whatever you want. You can't commit what is known as slander or libel. Slander is verbal, spoken, false speech to damage somebody's reputation. Like, I can't go out and just say, all right, this person's a cheater, and this person is going out and trying to steal money from people. They can sue me for slander. Okay. You also can't commit libel, which libel is the same thing as slander, but it's in written or published statements. And this is something that we've seen become a very, very big issue since the internet's development, because people just get on Facebook or message boards or in comment sections, or even TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, and publish stuff and can put out false speech or stuff to damage somebody's reputation, and it can be brought up as libel against you. And the other part of it too, and we're not going to watch these video links in this lecture. It's up to you if you want to watch them. I recommend highly that you do. They'll give you some good examples. And if we're in class, you guys see this in class, we will watch them. But speech also needs to be responsible. You need to be able to speak responsibly given where you're at. You know, like, you're not going to go into a department store and just start screaming fire. You know, you're not going to do that. You're not going to say or do certain things on an airplane or what have you, because that can lead to other issues. Like, if you went into a movie theater, started screaming fire, and then people started running out, got injured, maybe even were trampled to death in the worst case scenario, you'd be on the hook for that because you caused it. Now, if you're going to assemble, if you're going to protest, a lot of instances you're going to need to have a permit. That will need to be required. And that's okay. That's the proper channels. That's why you see that's why you might see people get arrested in a protest, or maybe not arrested, but asked to leave, because they might not have a permit. Now, if they have the permit and they're doing what they should be doing, then they're allowed to have that protest. Now, we're going to move on to the other amendments here. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Now, the origins of the Second Amendment were that it was to put an idea, a clause in for protection against actions by the British, because you already fought a war with them. Britain still had a really big presence on the North American continent and Canada into the Northwest, in the old Northwest territories and so forth. So there was protections against that. There was that overlooming threat that the British would come back. And also within the Second Amendment, Congress is allowed to regulate the sale of weapons. And we've seen this in terms of the regulations and laws, whether or not you can or can't have automatic weapons at various points in our history, making bump stocks illegal and so forth, with laws passed by Reagan in the 80s. But, you know, this has become the biggest controversial amendment because people get so up in arms about the Second Amendment. And I believe, this is my opinion, that you should have the right to bear arms, but I think there's certain things that need to change, both in terms of the laws, in terms of obtaining firearms, and then obviously there's a huge illegal gun trade that's out there that needs to be stopped. But people are so up in arms and divided about this, and you see people get so upset. They're like, they're going to take our guns away if somebody says something about the Second Amendment, and that might not be the case. But this is the one of those amendments that's so up for debate. It's really this controversial one in terms of you have a lot of people that don't actually listen to what's going on with it, or what are the issues that are being discussed, because you have a group that are just automatically predisposed to thinking, oh, we're going to lose our right here. And that's not necessarily the case depending on what's happening. So that's a big amendment up for debate. And we'll talk about that more in class if we have time, or you guys might write about it. The Third Amendment prevents government from forcibly quartering soldiers in homes. This is also another direct reflection of when this was created because of what happened during the American Revolution and before, where the British forcibly put soldiers in people's homes. The Fourth Amendment protects your right to privacy. It protects you against unlawful searches and seizures. And basically, cops need probable cause to search or arrest in a lot of instances. The political cartoon on your screen here, it says, pull him over, he must be drunk, because of all of the right conservative political bumper stickers he has in his car, is not probable cause to pull somebody over. It's not probable cause to arrest them for being drunk, in this case of the cartoon. You need probable cause. And you have to think what this is. And this is where a lot of people, specifically when we talk about this in class, teenagers will say, well, this happened to my friend or this happened to me. And they might not recognize that probable cause is just a simple basic action that a policeman sees. It also could be something where they're in the wrong too. They're human beings. They're not perfect. And then lastly, search and arrest warrants usually are issued in a lot of cases. Now, you're not going to see necessarily a search or arrest warrant if somebody's getting pulled over on the side of a street, but in terms of searching a home or arresting somebody, usually there's arrest warrants that are issued. All right, the Fifth Amendment. There are 4 protections that are laid out under the Fifth Amendment. One is you need ample evidence to be put on trial. You can't just be put on trial if there's no evidence. Okay. 2, double jeopardy. You cannot be tried for the same crime twice. So now there are a lot of convoluted things that can go with double jeopardy, whereas people can think, well, I got away with this, and then they do the exact same. They try to do the exact same thing, but there's circumstances that change that actually can turn that into not being the same crime, even if you technically did the same thing wrong. So that can seem confusing, but you can't be tried for the exact same crime twice. So like for the example in O.J. Simpson's case, this is the biggest one that everybody knows, is he cannot be tried for the murder of his ex-wife and her, I'm blanking on right now, whether it was her boyfriend or husband at the time. He can't be tried for those murders again. Number 3, you cannot be forced to testify against yourself. This is what's called pleading the fifth. If you guys take a second and watch the Dave Chappelle clip there, it's funny. You can plead the fifth so that you can't forcibly testify against yourself and implicate yourself in something that you might not otherwise feel that you're doing voluntarily. If you're being forced to do it, you don't have to. 4, you cannot deprive anyone of life, liberty, or the due process of law. Now, this is a really, really controversial point. This is what people use in terms of an argument against the death penalty. This is an argument that a lot of people use that are against abortion will use, saying this is a violation of Fifth Amendment rights because of life. In both instances of those examples of what I'm talking about. But basically, this means that you cannot, it's really hinging on the last part there, and it's up to interpretation, as we see with everything within the Constitution. Due process of law. You have to be allowed due process. Now, the other main point here on the screen is eminent domain. This allows for the government to seize property for public works by paying a fair price for property. So like if the government wants to come in and build, let's say, a transcontinental highway, and it just so happens that your property runs through where they want to go, if they can pay for that property at a fair price to get you to move so they can use that land, to purchase that land. All right, the Sixth Amendment is the right to a speedy public trial by an impartial jury, which is very important there, an impartial, meaning that you don't have a jury that is against you automatically. That's why jury selection is such an important thing. Also, what it means by speedy in public is speedy means that they're not holding you in jail for to await trial for months and years on end. Public means that it is open to the public record, and that you are open to a jury of your peers there. You also cannot hold, like I said, this one I already stated. This goes right here with the public option. I just did that with my fingers. Sorry. This goes right here with the public and speedy aspect, and so forth. You also can ask to be tried by a judge alone, or have a change of venue if you feel like you cannot get an impartial jury. So like if you think that you're in an area where you're just going to be taken advantage of by the jury itself because they're going to be against you no matter what, whether it's because of your reputation in the community, whether it's because of race, religion, or the crime itself, or who it was against, or whatever, you can ask for that to happen. It also gives you, the Sixth Amendment gives you the right to know your charges against you. You cannot just be tried and not know what you're being tried for. All right, the Seventh and Eighth Amendments. The Seventh Amendment is the right to trial by jury. You have that right to be given a trial by a jury. You can request not to have one, like I previously stated on the last slide. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail. So like if you commit a crime and steal $50, they can't put you on bail. They can't give you a bail $1 million. That's excessive. There's no chance for you to use that or be able to get out and be on bail. Bail is set to make sure that you actually appear for the trial. What a lot of people don't necessarily remember or know about bail is that you are actually returned that after the trial. If you choose not to go to that court appearance or trial, then you forfeit that bail to the state or to the federal government. This Eighth Amendment also prevents poor from serving longer than the maximum sentence if they're unable to pay. Basically saying, look, you're going to serve more because you can't pay your debts. Or, that's something that was linked in terms of old practices under England and other governments at the time. And then it prevents the cruel and unusual punishment aspect, such as not being put into stocks. This is also another argument that people put forward in terms of people being sentenced to death if they're against the death penalty. All right, the Ninth and Tenth Amendments. The Ninth Amendment basically is a cover your butt amendment. It basically says any rights that have not been spelled out in the Constitution already, whether it's the document itself or the previous amendments, that are directed or to be retained by the people, or protect all basic natural rights, are covered here. And then the 10th Amendment is really reaffirms the system of government we have, and being that it's federalism and we're a federal system where we have the relationship between the national and state governments in Article 4 of the Constitution. The 10th Amendment basically reaffirms that. All right, so this is going to be the longest lecture we have just because we're talking about each of the amendments. So we actually break this up into two parts in class. So at this point, if you are in class, we would stop. But if you're watching this online, you would stop here or continue if you choose to do so. All right, so there are 27 amendments in all. They're broken into three major groups. You have the Bill of Rights, which cover the first 10, but for the sake of the category 2, they add in the 11th and 12th. You have the Civil War amendments, and then you have the 20th century. So the first category, the Bill of Rights amendments, we just covered the first 10. And here, the 11th is it prevents any state from being sued by another state or nation. And this was reaffirmed by, really came out of the Supreme Court case of Chisholm versus Georgia. Basically, like, the rivalry between Michigan and Ohio. Michigan can't sue Ohio. Okay, you can't do that. Excuse me. The 12th Amendment is establishing rules, within the Electoral College. And it basically, what it does, it says use separate ballots for president and vice president. It's going to seem a little confusing, but essentially what that 12th Amendment did was it put the vice president as a running mate directly with the presidential candidate. Whereas in the elections before, the ballots weren't separate, and whoever finished second would become the vice president. And this developed because there was an issue within 1800 over in 1804 in terms of election, who should become president and so forth. All right, the Civil War amendments are the three that you see on screen. The 13th Amendment is basic outlaw slavery. We'll watch the movie Lincoln that kind of goes over that process. Fantastic movie. The 14th Amendment protects the legal rights of freed slaves and descendants in terms of when it was originally developed. Now, it has probably become over time to today where it protects rights of citizens and equal protection under the law for everyone. This has probably become the most important amendment outside of the first that we have because of its equal protection clause. And then the 15th Amendment prevents denial of voting rights based on race. And it's specific that you understand that it mentions race and a couple other things specifically, but gender is left out. And that's a key point to remember as we move forward here. All right, so now we're going to go to the third category. This is the 20th century amendments. They're wide-ranging and they reflect all the changes that were going on with a modern society out of the Industrial Revolution, out of the Progressive Era, and the World Wars and the Great Depression and the changing in the 60s and so forth. So the 16th Amendment establishes the individual income tax. So when you love to pay tax, everybody loves to pay taxes, right? This established the individual income tax. We pay our taxes every year in April, and this set this up so the government had more access to income. It was a growing entity, growing country. The 17th Amendment established people elect senators, not state legislatures. Now, this is important because this gave more direct electoral power in the vote of everyday people, because it wasn't until 1913 with this amendment that people elected their senators. Really, all you did from a popular standpoint was you voted for your local, all your local stuff, but you would vote for your representative, and then the House of Representatives in your state would elect a senator. And then, so you weren't directly electing them. It was through a representative way. And this changed it so now that people are electing by popular vote, not only their representative, but their senators as well. And it gave more direct power to the everyday people. All right, the 18th Amendment we've already talked about quite a bit in this course. It prevented the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. It's what we call prohibition. It eventually created more harm than good in terms of people trying to circumvent the process because you could sell alcohol for religious or medical purposes. There's all these ways around it. And really what happened is it developed out of the women's temperance movement as that grew and the horrors that came out of World War I, whereas people saw the world was just going to hell in a handbasket, and they thought that alcohol was something that actually led to this, which in some ways you can actually understand the argument, but it created more harm than good. The 19th Amendment, one of the greatest amendments we've had, something that should have been given, shouldn't have been an amendment. It should have happened immediately. Women were given the right to vote. This is very important for obvious reasons, but now you have your entire voting body, body that's of age to vote. Men and women can vote. Now, it is one thing to be known that women already in many places had the ability to vote on the state level, whether it was more local level versus whole state. Now it was a national issue. You could vote nationally. The 20th Amendment is set new term dates for the president, set the inauguration day for president, vice president. It's January 20th, by the way, of each year following the election. So the inauguration date coming up will be January 20th, 2021, whether it's a re-inauguration for President Trump or the inauguration for Joe Biden remains to be seen at this point, obviously. The 21st Amendment is what repealed the 18th in prohibition, but it did allow states to put laws of alcoholic possession intact. That's why you will see in various states across this country or various counties across this country, where it might be a dry county, you can't sell alcohol. And that's part of this law. And I think it's one of the biggest ironies of all how in 18 and 21 are the numbers for these amendments, given that 18 you can't drink, but you're an adult, but 21 you can, and these link up with the amendment topics. All right, here, this is actually a picture in a Detroit bar when they repealed the 18th Amendment. I just thought this is a really interesting picture and it being more local to show. All right, so just a few more amendments here to finish up. You have the 22nd and 23rd Amendments. So the 22nd Amendment limits the president's terms to 2, a maximum of 2. And this was passed because FDR, who you see on screen, was elected to 4 terms as president. He was the only president to ever pursue more than 2 terms as president, and was elected. And he was elected for a variety of reasons, because of the Great Depression, because of World War II, and because he was a pretty good president, but they passed it to limit that. And an adage here is you can actually serve more than 2 terms as president. You can serve, but it wouldn't be your direct term. So like if you were vice president, depending on how long that president served in that term, if they were to die, resign from office, or be impeached, you can actually become president as vice president for a specific amount of time and still retain 2 terms. And we'll talk about that specifically later on when we get to the executive branch. The 23rd Amendment was an important one. It gave D.C., anybody that lived in Washington, D.C., the ability to vote in the national election. They hadn't been able to do so until 1961. So that's why if you look at the electoral votes for the presidency, you have 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. And you're like, well, why is there 538? It's because you add in DC's electoral votes. The 24th Amendment prohibited poll tax. If you guys remember, poll tax is the requirement to pay a tax to vote. This is illegal. We have free elections. And this was primarily used in the South against minorities, specifically blacks. This made this illegal so that people had the right to free elections. 25th Amendment established presidential and succession VP. We talked about this previously in the last election. Basically establishes and reaffirms like, okay, these are the actual succession rates and so forth. But it's actually a very delicate issue because it can come up more often than not when we don't actually know this as a public, is when should be the president. The question is, when should the president be considered unable to perform his or her duties? And this could be something as simple as they're just sick. And they need to be, somebody needs to take over just for a few days or a week or so, to somebody committing crimes, and whether or not they need drawn up on impeachment. So this is something that's there. If there is a need for notification of change of power for brief instances, the Speaker of the House is always notified, as well as the highest ranking senator, which would be known as the President Pro Tem, as well as the Vice President. Okay, and then lastly here, to finish everything off, we have the 26th and 27th Amendments. The 27th Amendment in 1971 lowered the voting age to 18 because it was in 21 in some places for both the federal and state. And this was coming out of the Vietnam War, in that a lot of people were arguing that, look, these people are fighting and dying. These soldiers are fighting and dying for our country. And some of them don't even have the right to vote, whether it's in a state or federal election, because depending on the state, they had set it up as 18 or 21. And then this actually went along with some stuff going on with the drinking ages too at that time. And then that, where they lowered it to 18, that changed because people couldn't handle it. And it went back to 21, but those are linked together as well. That was more a state-based issue. The 27th Amendment, this is the last amendment that was added to the Constitution. I was 4 years old at the time. It dealt with congressional pay raises. And essentially what it spells out is that Congress can give themselves a pay raise, provided that pay raise doesn't take effect until the next term. So essentially what that means is that they're not essentially voting for them to get a pay raise. It could be their successor. It could be them, but it could be their successor. This is actually something that is not voted on quite a bit because it could be pretty controversial, given the fact that many of our congressmen and women are reelected. All right. Now, this was proposed with the Bill of Rights. It didn't pass, and it had to do with, in terms of time and time served, and then money and all this other stuff we won't get into for this course. All right, guys, that's all I got for you today. One last thing before I let you go, please make sure that you watch the videos that are with this. They're good examples. And also, please go back, review these lectures or parts of them, review your notes, and study for this test. And then look at your note guide for the Constitution that we did in that little group work activity with the Constitution. That is a nice study guide for you guys. All right, guys. Good luck on the Chapter 3 test of the U.S. Constitution. See ya.